The three methods of restraint for radiology would be your lateral. You would place your patient on their side to take the radiograph. You would use the dorsal ventral recumbency. You put them on their back to help take the radiograph. This is good for when you want like the thorax and you want to see their heart. And then there's also the ventrodorsal, where they're actually on their bellies, and then you can see from their backs, you can see like their lungs if you were doing a if you were looking at the thorax. So those would be the three restraint methods in radiology. Another positioning aid for taking radiographs could be using a leash or a rope to guide the patient's limbs wherever you want them to go. You could tie it to a patient's limb, and positioning, let's say we were doing lateral and we needed to extend his leg a little bit. You could get he could be sedated, and then you could just pull his arm wherever direction you wanted. That way we could get a good view of his humerus, his radius, ulna, something like that. And the leash will help by keeping yourself, the technician, at a greater distance from the patient, and you can still monitor the legs and put them wherever you wanted them to go. Aside from personal protective equipment, another type of protective barrier would include either like a wall made out of lead or protective screens that you can position to protect yourself from the scatter radiation. So distance and time are important safety measures as well in radiation and in taking radiographs, because the farther you are from the direct beam source of X-ray, the less radiation you are going to get from it. So whenever you are taking a radiograph, it is best to stay as far away from the primary beam as you can, because that means you're getting less scatter radiation. Same goes with time. The less time that you are exposed to the X-rays, the less radiation that you are going to get. It's important to remember that even though you have protective equipment, it can protect you from only like 25% of the scatter radiation. So you are still exposed. So the farther you are and the less time you take, the less exposure to the X-rays that you are going to be, which is also the reason why you want to get your X-ray exposure on the first take. The more you have to retake your images, the more exposure that it is that you are exposing. The more exposure to radiation is that you're exposing not only yourself but the patient. So that's why it's important to try and get it on the first take. For the VD thorax view, for the collimation, you would start, the cranial border would be at the thoracic inlet, and then the caudal border would be at the start of the very first lumbar vertebrae, and then include both the side walls, and make sure that the vitro is also included. And then for centering, you want to go at the midline, close to the end of the caudal borders of the scapula. For the OFA, for collimation, cranially, you would want to include the crest of the ilium, and caudally, you want to be a little distal to the patellus. For the lateral sides, you want to include the greater trochanters, where the femur and the attaches to the hips, and for the centering of the beam, you want to include it on the ischial tuberosities, to get a good exposure. For the cradiocaudal view of the radius and ulna, we want to be proximal to the elbow and distal to the carpus for our collimation. And then for centering, we want to be at the mid shaft of the radius and ulna. That's where we want our primary beam. So it is important to use gloves as part of your personal protective equipment when you are taking x-rays. The reason why I did not use gloves for my exposures, to be completely honest, they were really big for me, and they were getting in the way of positioning the patient. But it is always important to remember that scatter radiation is gonna affect you the most whenever you're taking x-rays. The lead gloves would have protected me from scatter radiation, especially the hands, because they're probably the thing that is going to be closest to the primary beam, because that's what you're using to position your patients. But in the future, I would hope to get more used to using the gloves to help position my patient, maybe get a different size of gloves, but definitely try to get used to what you have, to be as protected from the x-rays as you can, especially if you're going to be taking these so often. So that's what I hope to do in the future. Try to get used to your personal protective equipment, and trying to find a way to make it work for you, even if you have to position the patient, find a way to make it work.